The stubborn shadow. The morning Edric found the egg, he had been doing nothing more heroic than hauling firewood. This was, in his estimation, the proper kind of morning, cold at the edges, smelling of pine resin and turned earth, the kind of morning that asked nothing of a man except that he move steadily and keep his back straight. The Asheville forest was quiet in the way old forests are always quiet, not empty but patient. The trees here were tall and serious, the kind that had been standing long before anyone thought to give the land a name, and they had the posture to prove it. They did not lean. They did not bend towards sunlight like younger, more eager trees. They simply stood as though stillness itself was something that had to be earned over centuries, and they had earned it. Edric appreciated that about them. He appreciated things that did not require much from him in return. He was 38 years old, built like a man who had carried heavy things for most of his life and had stopped noticing the weight. His hands were the hands of a craftsman, wide-palmed, scarred across the knuckles, with the particular roughness that came not from neglect but from decades of wood and stone and rope. His hair had gone mostly gray at the temples, though he was not a man who spent time looking in mirrors, and so this was largely academic information as far as he was concerned. His face had the settled look of someone who had passed through a number of difficult things and arrived, not unscarred but intact. He did not smile easily. He was not unfriendly. He simply did not feel that expression was something to be spent carelessly. He had come out before dawn, as he usually did, to the eastern edge of the forest where the old pines grew thick and the deadfall was reliable. He preferred to get the heavy work done before the world properly woke up, before the village started its noise and its opinions and its general aliveness. Not that he disliked people. He simply found that mornings went better without them. He had already made 2 trips back to the cottage with armloads of split wood, stacking them against the eastern wall under the overhang where they would dry without taking on rain. He was on his 3rd trip when he stopped. He stopped because something caught his eye that was not bark, was not stone, was not any of the ordinary things that lived at the base of old pine trees. He almost missed it entirely. The light at that hour was still the thin, undecided kind, not quite dawn, not quite morning, filtering down through the canopy in long gray shafts that illuminated mostly dust and the occasional drifting seed. But the object caught even that pale light differently than its surroundings. There was a warmth to its color, a depth. Edric set down his axe against the nearest trunk and crouched. The egg, or what had been an egg, sat in a shallow depression between 2 roots, as though it had been deliberately placed there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It was the size of a man's fist, maybe slightly larger, the kind of size that made it feel significant without being dramatic about it. The shell was rust-red, deep and complex, not a single clean color but layered, the way old iron looks when it's been left in the rain for years and has developed something almost like character. It was cracked clean down the middle, split along a single vertical seam with the clean decisiveness of something that had known exactly how and where to emerge. He picked it up. He had not intended to. His hands just did it, the way hands sometimes move before the mind has finished deciding. The shell was warm, not residually warm, not the warmth of something that had been warm and was slowly surrendering it, but actively warm the way a stone feels after a long afternoon of sun. Whatever had been inside had been there recently, very recently. He turned the pieces over in his palms, examining them. The interior of the shell was smooth, the color of polished moonstone, and it curved with a precision that did not feel accidental. He had worked with wood long enough to recognize craftsmanship, even when nature was the craftsman. This shell had been built with intention, every layer of it. He set it back down carefully, which surprised him slightly. He was not usually a careful man with things that had already been broken. He stood, he looked around the clearing. The forest gave him nothing, just its usual patient stillness, the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere deeper in the trees, the sound of wind moving through the upper branches like a conversation held just too far away to follow. He picked up his axe. He went back to work. He had 3 logs split, good clean splits, the wood cooperative this morning, the grain straight and predictable when he heard it. It was not a large sound, that was the first thing he noticed. Most sounds that changed the course of a man's day arrived with appropriate weight, a shout, a crack of thunder, something that demanded attention by volume alone. This was not that. This was small, dry and papery, like the sound of a letter being unfolded or a wing being tested for the first time against unfamiliar air. A shuffling, a settling, the sound of something that existed and was not yet certain what to do about it. He turned. It was sitting 5 feet away from him, in a small patch of ground where the morning light had finally committed to arriving. Sitting very still, very upright, with a posture that was either accidental or deliberate, and Edric strongly suspected the latter. His first impression was small, embarrassingly, improbably small. He had seen illustrations of dragons. Everyone had seen illustrations of dragons. The old manuscripts were full of them, all dramatic wingspan and mountain-scorching fire and the distant suggestion of civilization's ending. The creature sitting 5 feet away from him bore almost no resemblance to those illustrations. It was, at its most generous assessment, the size of a barn cat. A well-fed barn cat, perhaps, but still. Its scales had the soft, unfixed quality of something that had not yet made all its permanent decisions. The color shifted when the light shifted, somewhere in the territory between copper and deep char, occasionally catching the low morning sun and throwing back a brief flash of something almost gold before settling back into ambiguity. Its wings were folded neatly against its back, pressed tight and tidy, and they were translucent in the way of new leaves, veined, delicate, carrying light through them rather than stopping it. Its tail was wrapped in a precise curl around its feet, as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if it knew already the value of appearing composed. Its eyes were amber, not honey amber, not the vague yellowish quality that word sometimes implies, but amber like a coal at the moment just before it goes from glowing to truly burning, deep and backlit and very, very alert. They looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment that stretched itself out longer than it had any right to. "Go on," Edric said. His voice came out flatter than he intended, not unkind, but direct in the way of someone who does not have a great deal of experience in addressing recently hatched mythological creatures. He moved one hand in a gesture that he imagined was universally interpretable as shoo. "Off with you, go find your mother." The hatchling tilted its head, precisely 45 degrees. The mathematical exactness of it was somehow more unnerving than if it had flinched or fled. Edric turned back to the wood. He split 4 more logs, and he did it well, and he focused very deliberately on the work, the weight of the axe through the arc, the alignment of the grain, the clean satisfaction of wood parting correctly. He was not thinking about the hatchling. He was absolutely not thinking about it. He was a practical man who had practical work to do on a practical morning, and that was the whole of the situation. When he turned to stack the new pieces against the existing pile, the hatchling had closed the gap between them by half. It had not made a sound doing so. It sat now perhaps 2.5 feet away in the same composed posture, tail still curled, eyes still fixed on him with an attention that felt almost rude in its completeness. As if he were the only thing in this entire forest worth looking at. As if everything else, the trees, the birds, the pale morning sky, was simply backdrop. "I am not," Edric said, setting down a log with more care than the moment required, "a dragon keeper." He was not certain why he was explaining himself to it. He explained himself to very few people, and none of them had amber eyes and nascent wings. The hatchling blinked, slowly, with the absolute deliberateness of a creature communicating something it considered self-evident. It was, he would later reflect, the most condescending blink he had ever received from any living thing, including several humans who had made condescension something of a life practice. He picked up his axe. He did not look at it again. He told himself he was not looking at it again. He lasted approximately 4 minutes. When he looked, it was sitting directly behind his left boot. Not beside it, not near it. Directly behind it, close enough that when he shifted his weight backward without thinking, his heel nearly came down on the thing. He caught himself in time barely and looked down at the hatchling, which looked back up at him from a distance of perhaps 8 inches with an expression that he could only describe as patient. Not nervous, not startled by his near misstep. Patient, the way things are patient when they have already arrived where they intended to be. "You cannot sit there," Edric told it. It sat there. He considered his options. He could pick it up and move it, but he found, when he actually contemplated doing this, that he was not entirely certain about the protocol involved. Dragon hatchlings were not livestock. They were not feral cats. The old stories were contradictory on nearly every practical point, but they were consistent on one: you did not handle them without permission. The ones that gave permission were one thing. The ones that didn't were the reason certain villages existed only in historical documents. This one had not given permission. It had also not given any indication that it would refuse it. It was simply sitting behind his boot, breathing, existing with a thoroughness that small things sometimes managed, filling its own space completely, without apology, without uncertainty. He stood there for another long moment. Then he went back to work, moving carefully, stepping with attention to where his feet landed. The hatchling shifted when he moved, adjusting its position with small, precise steps that kept it consistently behind his left boot. When he turned, it recalibrated. When he reached for a log and his boot moved 18 inches to the right, the hatchling moved 18 inches to the right. By the time he had the last of the morning's wood split and stacked, he had stopped pretending he wasn't aware of it. The walk home from the forest took 20 minutes on the mill road if a man walked at a decent pace without stopping. Edric calculated that it would take him considerably longer this morning. He set off, the hatchling followed. He walked at his normal pace first, because he was a man who did not adjust himself for inconveniences as a general principle. The hatchling trotted. It had a particular gait, four-legged, with a slight rolling quality, the wings half-lifting for balance on uneven ground that was frankly not the dignified locomotion one associated with the apex predators of the old world, but it was effective. It kept pace with him without apparent difficulty, its amber eyes fixed forward, its small face carrying the expression of a creature that had somewhere to be and knew exactly where that somewhere was. He walked faster. The hatchling broke into something that he supposed qualified as a gallop, a rapid four-limbed scramble that should have looked ridiculous and nearly did, except that it covered ground with an efficiency that left no room for mockery. It caught up with him in 11 seconds, he counted. He stopped abruptly, the hatchling stopped. It sat down, tucked its tail, and waited. He started again, it started again. He changed direction without warning, angling left off the main trail onto the narrower path that cut through the lower meadow. The hatchling turned with him, on the inside of the corner, already anticipating the angle. It had been following him for, he did a rough calculation, perhaps 45 minutes at this point, and it had apparently spent that time learning his stride pattern. He stopped again and looked down at it. It looked up at him. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked it. This was, he recognized as the words left his mouth, a somewhat absurd question, given that the answer was obviously wherever he was going. The hatchling confirmed this by doing nothing, which somehow communicated exactly where you're going with perfect clarity. He walked on. Oswin's cart came into view at the crossroads, the old farmer making his weekly grain run to the mill, his gray horse plodding with the specific energy of an animal that had given up on having opinions about its mornings. Oswin himself was the kind of man who noticed things and mentioned them. He noticed things in the way some people collected objects, automatically, compulsively, with the immediate instinct to share the acquisition. He noticed the hatchling approximately 3 seconds after Edric came into view. Edric looked straight ahead and did not change his pace. "Morning, Edric," Oswin said, pulling the horse to a stop with the air of a man who had just been handed a story worth slowing down for. His eyes had found the hatchling and were staying there with the focused quality of a hunting dog that had picked up a scent. "Oswin," Edric said. "Fine mornings." "It is." A pause, the horse shifted. Oswin's eyes traveled from the hatchling to Edric and back to the hatchling. "Is that," he said slowly, "the way people speak when they are fairly certain of what they are looking at and are hopping for confirmation?" "No," said Edric. Oswin looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at Oswin with the polite disinterest of something that had already conducted its evaluation of the situation and found the farmer to be not particularly relevant. Then it returned its gaze to Edric's left boot, to which it had drawn close again with the subtle persistence of a shadow in afternoon sun. "It appears," Oswin said carefully, "to be following you." "It's confused," Edric said. "It'll stop." Oswin's expression suggested that Oswin did not share this confidence. "My cousin's wife's family, out in the Thorn Valley, they had a thing like this happen, decades back. The dragon that chose their grandfather followed him home from a market in Aldenver, and—" "Good morning, Oswin," Edric said and walked on. He heard Oswin begin to say something else, heard the thought trail off into the particular silence of a man who has realized that his audience has removed itself from the conversation. He kept walking. The hatchling kept pace at his left boot, its small claws clicking faintly on the packed earth of the road in a rhythm that was already, alarmingly, beginning to sound familiar. The crossroads were 2 minutes behind him when he stopped without planning to, stood in the middle of the road, and looked down at the thing following him. He stood there for what he estimated was 10 minutes, though it may have been less. He stood with his arms crossed and his axe over one shoulder and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who is making a serious effort to wait something out. The morning continued around him. A crow crossed the sky from west to east. The distant sound of the mill wheel reached him on the breeze. The road was empty in both directions. The hatchling sat down on his left foot. Not beside the foot, not near the foot. On the foot, specifically on the toes of his left boot, settling its small weight onto them with the precision of something that had chosen its location with intention and was not interested in reconsidering. It was heavier than it looked. Not alarmingly so, but present, a warmth and a weight that was impossible to ignore, and a warmth that came not just from the ambient temperature but from the creature itself, radiating out through the leather of his boot with a steadiness that reminded him, unreasonably, of a hearthstone. It looked up at him, then it closed its eyes. It fell asleep on his foot, in the middle of the road, in the middle of the morning, as if this were simply what feet were for. Edric looked at it for a long time. The sun continued to climb. The crow was long gone. Somewhere behind him, he could faintly hear Oswin's cart moving on toward the mill, the slow percussion of horse hooves on packed earth growing fainter and finally disappearing into the general quiet of the countryside. He thought about the empty shell, the warmth it had still held. He thought about the depression in the earth between those two roots, the way the egg had sat there as if placed deliberately, as if someone or something had known that particular spot would be found by a particular person at a particular hour. He did not think about this for long. He was not a man who spent a great deal of time on thoughts that led to unsettling conclusions. He began to walk again slowly, very slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who is trying not to disturb something that has decided to sleep on his foot, which required a shuffling, forward-tilting gait that was not his usual manner of movement, and that he would have found in any other context completely undignified. The hatchling woke the moment he opened his gate, some alert inner sense that registered the change in sound, the creak of the old iron hinge, the shift from road to gravel path. It lifted its head, looked around at the cottage and the yard and the woodpile along the eastern wall with a sweeping amber gaze that somehow managed to convey assessment. And then it looked back up at Edric with an expression that he could not have described precisely, but that gave him the distinct and slightly unnerving impression of something that had expected to arrive here, and was therefore not surprised that it had. He walked through the gate, the hatchling walked through the gate. He walked to the door, the hatchling walked to the door. He opened the door, went inside. The hatchling followed him through as if it had done so every morning for years, as if the threshold were a thing it had already crossed in some version of events, and this was merely the first time Edric was present for it. He stood in the middle of his cottage, his small, practical cottage, with its workbench along the north wall and its single hearth and its two chairs and its complete absence of anything that could be reasonably described as accommodation for a mythological creature. And he looked at his surroundings, and he looked at the hatchling, which had already begun to investigate the perimeter of the room with small, deliberate steps, sniffing at the base of the workbench, examining a pile of wood shavings with amber eyes that missed very little. Edric set his axe against the wall. He pulled off his boots and set them by the door, which was habit, and then he stood there in his socked feet watching the hatchling discover his home. After a moment it padded back across the room to the boots. It sniffed both of them. It looked back at him once, a brief, direct look that he was beginning to learn carried more information than it appeared to, and then it curled itself against the left boot, pressing its side to the worn leather with the careful deliberateness of something claiming territory not by force but by presence, by simple, absolute intention. Its scales had settled now, he noticed. The uncertainty of the morning, that shifting, uncommitted quality, was gone. They were copper-black, deep and definite, the color of iron that has passed through fire and come out changed but not diminished. In the low light of the cottage, they caught the glimmer of the banked hearth and held it, turning it into something warmer. The hatchling closed its eyes. Its tail curled once around the toe of his boot. Edric looked at it for a very long time. Outside, the morning was finishing its business and making way for noon. The light through the single east-facing window had shifted from the tentative gray of early hours to something fuller, more committed light that cast actual shadows and meant business. The forest beyond the meadow was a dark line at the edge of the fields, keeping its own counsel, offering nothing in the way of explanation. He had not asked for this. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had not asked, had not sought, had done nothing that any reasonable accounting of events could describe as invitation. He had split firewood. He had crouched by a broken shell because his hands had moved before his mind had finished thinking. He had come home by the road he always came home by, at the time he always came home, carrying the axe he always carried. He had simply been there, he had simply stayed. Perhaps that was it in the end. Perhaps the hatchling had not chosen him for anything he had done, or anything he was, or any quality that could be named and evaluated. Perhaps it had chosen him because he was the only one who had paused long enough in the right place at the right hour to be found. Perhaps choosing was sometimes as simple and as enormous as that, not destiny, not fate, nothing so grand as the old stories like to make it. Just a morning. Just a man who stayed when he might have walked on. He found that he could not make himself feel annoyed about it, which was itself a kind of information. He pulled on a second pair of socks. The cottage was cold in the mornings without the fire properly built up, and he went to the workbench and sat down and looked at the half-finished chair leg clamped in the vise. He had 3 of those to finish before the end of the week. He had practical work. He had a life that ran on practical things, and he had managed it alone for years without incident, and there was no particular reason why any of that needed to change. He picked up his spokeshave, he looked at the wood. From across the room, pressed against his left boot, something warm and newly definite breathed in the rhythm of sleep. Edric put the tool to the wood and he worked, and he did not look over. He did not need to look over. He knew it was there. and it knew with the whole certain unargued knowledge of something that has made a permanent decision on a temporary morning that this was where it lived. The long walk homes. He did not feed it that first afternoon. This was a deliberate decision, and Edric was clear with himself about the reasoning. Feeding it would constitute an agreement. It would be a handshake between parties, a confirmation of terms, and he had not yet decided whether he was willing to confirm anything. He was a man who read contracts carefully before signing them, not that he had signed many, but the principle held. He did not commit to things without understanding what he was committing to. The hatchling, for its part, did not appear to require his agreement. It slept against his boot for the better part of 2 hours, with the absolute thoroughness of something that had spent the entire morning being born and finding a home and had earned the rest. When it woke, it stretched, and the stretch was extraordinary in the way that only very small things stretching can be. The wings unfolding a few inches before refolding, the spine arching, the tail uncurling and recurling, the whole small body reorganizing itself from sleep into wakefulness with an attention to the process that made Edric pause his work and watch without meaning to. Then it sat up, looked around the cottage with the alert, measuring gaze of something cataloging its environment, and began methodically exploring everything within reach. It examined the woodpile by the hearth, sniffing each log with apparent seriousness. It investigated the 2 chairs, walking around the base of each one twice before apparently reaching a conclusion. It found the corner where Edric kept his tools and stood there for a long time, amber eyes moving across the chisels and gouges and planes with an attention that was frankly unnerving in something that had been alive for approximately half a morning. It discovered the hearthrug, a thick, old, slightly misshapen oval of braided wool that had belonged to the cottage long before Edric had, and spent several minutes pressing various parts of its body against it experimentally, as if testing its properties. At no point did it make any sound beyond the faint click of its claws on the stone floor, and the small, dry whisper of its scales when it moved. At no point did it look at him with anything that could be described as hunger or need or demand. It simply existed in his cottage with the completeness of something that had already decided this space was its space too, and was now learning it. Edric watched all of this from the corner of his eye while pretending to focus on the chair leg. He admitted to himself around mid-afternoon, a poor pretender. The second morning was when the real difficulty began. Not the difficulty of the hatchling itself, it remained in practical terms undemanding. It had spent the night curled against the left boot which Edric had not moved, and when he came downstairs in the gray pre-dawn to build up the fire, it was already awake, sitting upright in the boot's shadow, watching him descend the stairs with an expression that managed to be both alert and unhurried. It greeted his arrival with the same tilted head attention it had given him the day before. He greeted its greeting with a non-committal grunt. The difficulty was not the hatchling, the difficulty was the village. Oswin had talked. Edric had known he had known it with the certainty of a man who has lived in a small place long enough to understand its operating principles. Oswin was not malicious. He was simply a man for whom information was a social currency, and he had spent the previous afternoon apparently distributing his considerable wealth. By the time Edric reached the market square that second morning for his weekly provisions run, 3 separate people greeted him with expressions that contained more knowledge than their words suggested. Merritt, the woman who sold eggs and kept an opinion about everything, was the first. She handed him his dozen eggs with the particular care of someone who wants to extend a transaction long enough to ask a question. "Heard you've got a visitor," she said. "I have a cottage," Edric said. "Heard the visitor's got scales. Eggs look good this week." She leaned forward slightly, her elbows on the market table, her expression balanced between curiosity and the kind of concern that sometimes is concern, and sometimes is something that wants to be concern when it grows up. "A dragon hatchling, Edric, that's not like finding a stray cat." "No," he agreed, "it's smaller." She stared at him, he picked up his eggs and moved on. The butcher's boy followed him with his eyes the entire length of the market. The miller's wife, who had no reason to be at the market on a second-day morning but was there nonetheless, intercepted him at the grain stall with a long and detailed account of a cousin who had once had an encounter with a dragon in the western provinces, the details of which did not match any story Edric had previously heard, and which seemed to be evolving in complexity as she told it. He listened to the relevant portions, extracted himself from the irrelevant ones, and continued on his rounds. What he did not say, to Merritt or the miller's wife or to old Paris who caught him at the gate, and spent 10 minutes telling him about the symbolic significance of dragon bonding as described in a book Paris had once owned, but no longer had and could not remember the title of. What he did not say to any of them was that the hatchling was at that moment sitting under his workbench at home, and that he had in the end left a small piece of salted venison on the floor beside it before going to sleep the previous night, and that the venison had been gone by morning. He had not committed to anything, that was what he told himself. The venison was simply practical, a small creature needed to eat, and he was not cruel, and cruelty by omission was still cruelty. It meant nothing beyond the simple hydraulics of keeping a living thing alive in his vicinity until the situation resolved itself. He did not examine the situation resolving itself part of this reasoning too closely, because he had begun to suspect it would not hold up under examination. By the fourth day, the hatchling had established a routine. This was perhaps what unsettled Edric most, not the presence of the creature, which he had begun to accommodate with the resigned flexibility of a man who understands that some things are simply happening, and his participation is not required for them to continue, but the routine, the fact of it. The way the hatchling had taken the rhythms of his days and fitted itself into them with the calm precision of a key finding a lock. It rose when he rose, which was before dawn, and sat at the top of the stairs watching him descend until he had the fire built up and the kettle on. Then it came down and stationed itself near the hearth, close enough to feel the heat but not so close as to seem excessive about it. It had opinions about excessive. Edric had no evidence for this but felt it strongly. While he worked at the bench, it settled under it, usually curled against the left boot if he had left it there, or against the leg of the bench directly behind where his left foot rested. It did not interrupt his work. It did not demand attention. It breathed and occasionally shifted position, and once on the third day made a sound, a low, complex sound, not quite a growl and not quite a hum, somewhere in the register of a large cat's purr if the cat in question had grown up around furnaces, and then did not make the sound again, as if it had been a test that had yielded sufficient data. In the afternoons, when Edric took his 20-minute walk down to the river to clear his head, a habit of years, something he had done in all weathers without particular fanfare, the hatchling came. It had by the third day stopped trotting behind his left boot and begun walking beside it, which was a shift in positioning that Edric noticed and did not comment on. Beside was different from behind. Behind was following. Beside was something else, a different word, a different shape, and he let it sit in his thoughts without turning it over too many times. At the river, the hatchling sat on the bank and watched the water. The first time Edric had watched it watch the water, half expecting some reaction, some ancient instinct triggered by the movement of water over stone. What he had gotten was an expression of focused attention, the amber eyes tracking the current with what looked remarkably like intellectual interest, as if it were learning something, as if the river were teaching it something it had decided was worth knowing. He had found himself wondering what it saw. Then he had stopped wondering because that was the kind of thought that led places. It was on the sixth morning that the incident with Brandock happened, and it was that incident that clarified certain things for Edric in ways that the previous 6 mornings had been building toward without quite arriving. Brandock was not a man Edric had strong feelings about, which was itself a kind of feeling. He was the kind of man villages produced occasionally, not bad in any way that could be specifically prosecuted, but possessed of the particular confidence of someone who had never had a significant portion of his certainty corrected by events. He was large and he was loud, and he had decided in the wake of Oswin's news that the thing to do was come and see for himself, and possibly handle the situation, though he was vague on what situation he meant and what handling it would involve. He arrived at Edric's gate on the 6th morning, while Edric was in the yard splitting wood, back to his ordinary routines now, the hatchling at its customary station near his left boot, and he leaned on the gate post with the ease of a man who considers all spaces public if he's interested in them. "So it's true," Brandock said, looking at the hatchling with an expression that contained enthusiasm in a ratio Edric found immediately suspicious. "What's true?" Edric said, not stopping his work. The hatchling, Brandock opened the gate, not asked, simply opened and came into the yard, which was also not asked. Thought Oswin was exaggerating. He exaggerates, but look at that. He crouched 3 feet away from the hatchling and extended one hand in the universal gesture of someone who has decided an animal wants to be touched and has not inquired whether the animal agrees. The hatchling looked at the hand. It looked at it with an attention so complete and so still that Brandock's hand slowed in its approach without him appearing to consciously decide to slow it. He stopped. He kept his expression confident, but his hand had learned something his face hadn't caught up to yet. "Careful," Edric said. "I'm fine," Brandock said, with the certainty of someone who is not yet not fine and therefore believes they will never be not fine. He moved his hand another inch forward. The hatchling did not move. It did not flinch, did not retreat, did not spread its wings in any of the displays that the old manuscripts described as warning signs. It simply looked at the hand with those amber eyes, and something in that look, some quality of temperature, of depth, of assessment conducted and found unflattering, made Brandock pull his hand back without apparent awareness that he was doing so. He stood up. He put his hand in his pocket. "Doesn't seem friendly," he said, recovering quickly, which was a skill he had practiced. "It's not unfriendly," Edric said, which was the most accurate thing he had said about the hatchling yet. Brandok looked at the hatchling for another moment, then looked at Edric, then arrived at whatever conclusion he had been moving toward since opening the gate without being asked. "You should bring it to the Aldenmere Sanctuary," he said. "They handle things like this. Old Warden Sulith has dealt with dragons before, they'd know what to do with it." Edric set the axe down on the block. He straightened up. He was not a tall man, not short either, but not the tallest, and Brandok had several inches on him, but there was something in the way Edric straightened that made the inches irrelevant. "It's not a thing," he said. Brandok heard the sentence. He heard it the way people hear sentences that arrive with more weight than their words technically carry. He looked at Edric. He looked at the hatchling, which had not moved, and which was watching Brandok with an expression that now seemed unmistakably like an opinion. "I'm just saying," Brandok said carefully, "that it's a dragon. It's not like keeping a dog." "I'm aware," Edric said, "of what it is." Another pause. The yard was quiet. The hatchling's tail curled once slowly around Edric's left boot, and the gesture was so unhurried, so certain, so completely without performance that Brandok looked at it and seemed to understand something that he had not understood 30 seconds ago. "Right," he said. He moved toward the gates. "Well, if you need anything." "I won't," Edric said, "but thank you." Brandok left. He left the gate properly latched behind him, which Edric noted, because Brandok was not typically a man who closed gates properly. People adjusted their behavior around things they had decided to respect. It was a reliable signal. Edric stood in his yard for a moment, looking at the hatchling, which was looking up at him with its amber eyes and its composed face, and its tail still loosely wrapped around his boot. He crouched down. He was not entirely sure why he crouched. It was not a thing he had planned to do. But he found himself there at eye level with the hatchling, close enough that he could see the individual scales with clarity, could see that they were not in fact uniform in color but varied by fractions, some holding copper, some leaning toward black, some catching the morning light and throwing back something that was almost iridescent for half a second before settling. He could see the intricate, precise construction of its folded wings. He could see the faint motion of its breathing. It looked at him, he looked at it. Something passed between them that was not language but was not nothing. "All right," Edric said. He did not specify what this was in response to. The hatchling did not require specification. The change after that was not dramatic. Edric would not have permitted a dramatic change. He was not a man whose life accommodated drama, and he had no intention of beginning at 38. But things shifted, the way things shift when a decision that has been sitting in a man's chest for several days finally settles into place. Not with a crash, but with a click, the small definitive sound of something fitting where it was always going to fit. He moved a flat, smooth stone near the hearth so the hatchling had a warm place to rest that was not the boot. And the hatchling used it during the evenings, though it returned to the boot by morning, which Edric had expected and therefore was not surprised by and absolutely did not find satisfying in the way that he clearly found it satisfying. He began adjusting his portions at meals with a slight excess that always seemed to produce a small, convenient surplus. He did not call this feeding the hatchling. He called it poor measuring. But his measuring had been precise for 38 years, so this was not a convincing argument, and he did not make it to anyone but himself. He spent an evening sitting by the fire, the hatchling on its hearthstone, reading through the one book in his modest shelf that addressed dragons in any practical way. It was an old book, a compendium of natural histories, the dragon section written by someone who had clearly been working from other people's accounts rather than direct observation, and it was full of confident inaccuracies that Edric could already identify after 6 days of observation. The section on hatchlings was particularly confused, describing them as either catatonic or violent in their first weeks, offering no middle ground for the possibility that one might simply sit quietly under a workbench and learn the sound of a spokeshave moving along grain. He read it anyway. Some of it was useful. The parts about diet, the confirmation that young dragons required protein and heat and not, as one margin note suggested, moonlight and crushed gemstone, were reassuring in the way that confirming you have been doing something correctly is always quietly reassuring. He set the book aside. The fire had burned low. The hatchling was on the hearthstone with its eyes open, watching the embers. In the firelight, it was a different creature than it was in daylight. The copper black of its scales absorbed the ember glow and transformed it, holding it in the way that dark water holds light, something that seemed both warm and deep. Its wings had grown fractionally since the first morning, not enough that anyone else would notice probably, but Edric had been looking. The translucence was thickening slightly at the base. They were becoming something more opaque, more permanent, more decided. Everything about it was becoming more decided, he thought. Every day it seemed to settle further into whatever it was going to be. As if being found, being followed home, being permitted, that sequence had given it permission to commit to its own existence more fully. As if it had needed the certainty of where it was before it could figure out what it was. He understood this more than he intended to. He banked the fire and went to bed, leaving the hearthstone warm. In the morning, he came downstairs to find the hatchling already awake and already stationed near the left boot by the door, waiting for the day to begin, its amber eyes carrying their familiar expression of attention without urgency, presence without demand. Outside, a pale winter sun was making its careful way above the tree line, throwing long early shadows across the frost-stiff grass of the yard, and touching the woodpile with the tentative warmth of a season not yet fully committed to its own existence. Inside, without particularly deciding to, Edric said, "Good morning." The hatchling tilted its head at precisely the angle it always tilted, and he went to build up the fire, and they began another day in the same small space, the same quiet rhythms, the same unspoken and increasingly unarguable fact of their arrangement. The village had not stopped talking. Probably it would not stop for some time. Brandok had gone home and told his version of what he had seen, and Oswin's version was still circulating, and Merritt had opinions that she was sharing with anyone who purchased eggs. There would be more visitors. There would be more well-meaning advice and poorly concealed curiosity, and the particular weight of a community that was not certain what to do with a situation that did not fit its categories. Edric had considered all of this, in the way he considered things briefly, practically, without ceremony. The hatchling had chosen his feet as home on the first morning in the middle of a road with the absolute certainty of something that did not make provisional decisions. It had not consulted the village. It had not required Edric's verbal agreement. It had simply decided, and the deciding had been enough, and everything since had been the world arranging itself around a thing that had already been determined. He was, he supposed, doing the same. He put the kettle on. The hatchling settled near the hearthstone, watching the fire catch with those calm and burning eyes, and the cottage filled with the ordinary sounds of morning, water coming to heat, wood settling in the grate, the distant first birds of the day conducting their business outside in a world that was, in every visible way, exactly what it had been a week ago. Except that it wasn't, and they both knew it. And neither of them required the other to say so. What home means. The name came to him on the 9th day, which surprised him, because he had not been looking for one. He had been deliberately not looking for one. Nomming was a threshold he had identified early and had been carefully not approaching, in the same way a man can stand at the edge of something high and simply not look down, not from fear exactly, but from the practical understanding that looking down changes the relationship between a man and the height in a way that cannot be undone. He had fed the hatchling. He had moved the hearthstone. He had said good morning to it for 3 consecutive days. These were things he could, with sufficient creativity, explain as practical accommodations. A name was different. A name was a door with no handle on the outside. He had been at the workbench, working on the last of the chair legs, the afternoon light coming through the east window at the low flat angle of winter, laying long shadows across the floor and turning the wood shavings gold where they caught it. The hatchling was on the hearthstone, which had become its afternoon position as reliably as behind the boot was its morning position. It seemed to have an internal cartography of the cottage now, specific places assigned to specific hours. A private geography that it navigated with the certainty of something that had always lived here and had simply been elsewhere for a while waiting. Edric had been watching the chisel, watching the grain, not thinking about anything in particular in the productive way that manual work sometimes enabled, the mind going quiet at the surface while something deeper continued its business undisturbed. And from that quieter place, without announcement or deliberation, a word arrived.
Well,
He held it in his mind for a moment, examining it the way he had examined the broken shell, turning it over, checking its weight, its fit. Ash for the color of its scales in certain lights, that deep char that was neither black nor gray but something between them that had its own integrity. Ash for the forest where it had found him, the old pine forest at the edge of the Ashville. Ash for the hearthstone it had claimed, the particular territory of warmth and emberglow that it had made its own with the quiet confidence of something that understood the value of fire in its bones before it had ever made any. Short, practical, not romantic. He tried it once very quietly, barely a breath above silence. Ash. The hatchling's head came up from the hearthstone. Not quickly, not startled, not reactive. Deliberately, in the measured way it did everything, as if the motion had been decided half a second before it occurred, and the decision was already confirmed before the neck had finished moving. It looked at him across the cottage with those amber eyes that always carried more in them than eyes that size should reasonably contain. It looked at him for a long moment. Then it put its head back down on the hearthstone, closed its eyes, and continued whatever it had been doing, which appeared to be a kind of deep, contemplative stillness that was not quite sleep. Edric turned back to the chair leg. He worked for another 20 minutes in silence. Then he said, slightly louder this time, with the particular evenness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to fuss about it, "All right, Ash." The hatchling did not lift its head this time, but its tail, which had been still, moved once, a single, slow curl from base to tip, the way a flag moves in a light wind, and then was still again. Edric nodded to himself and went back to the grain of the wood, and the name settled into the cottage around them like dust settling after a room has been rearranged, finding its level, becoming part of what was simply true. Merritt came on the 11th day with what she called a friendly visit, and what Edric recognized as reconnaissance. She arrived mid-morning, with a basket that contained half a dozen eggs he hadn't ordered and a jar of preserved plums that were clearly a pretext. And she stood at his door with the particular energy of a woman who has prepared several conversational openings and is deciding which to deploy. He let her in because she was not a bad person and the cold had gotten serious overnight, and because he had decided some days ago that the village was going to have to arrive at its equilibrium regarding the situation sooner or later, and managed arrivals were preferable to unmanaged ones. Ash was on the hearthstone. Merritt stopped 3 feet inside the door and looked at it with an expression that moved rapidly through several stages: recognition, recalibration, and then a careful settling into something that was trying to be neutral but was not quite making it. "Well," she said, "there it is." "There it is," Edric agreed. He took her basket, he put the kettle on. She stood watching Ash with the focused attention of a woman gathering data. Ash, for its part, had opened its eyes when she entered, conducted its assessment, and then maintained a steady, unreadable gaze in her direction that she was clearly finding more affecting than she wanted to admit. "It's smaller than I thought," she said finally. "It's young," Edric said. "Brandok said it was hostile." Brandok reached for it without asking. It declined. She seemed to find this reasonable. She moved slightly closer, not reaching, simply closing the distance. Ash watched her close it. It did not tilt its head the way it tilted its head at Edric. That particular movement, he had come to understand, was specific and not general, a distinction it made between him and others with a consistency that he was not going to examine too carefully. With Merritt, it simply watched, steady and evaluating. "Does it have a name?" she asked. "Ash," Edric said. She repeated it quietly, "Ash. Then did you name it or did you find out its name?" He paused with the cups in his hands and looked at her, because it was a more precise question than he had expected from her. She shrugged at his expression. "There are 2 schools of thought," she said. "My grandmother had the old books. Dragons don't get named by people, according to some of them. They already have names and the person just receives them." He set the cups down. He thought about the afternoon light and the wood shavings and the word arriving from somewhere he hadn't sent it. "I don't know," he said, which was the most accurate answer. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She stayed for the tea and for a portion of conversation that was, by her standards, restrained. She asked no direct questions about the future, made no further observations about sanctuaries or wardens, and left with her basket after offering the opinion that the preserved plums were good with hard cheese, which was advice he did not ask for but noted. At the door, she paused. "People are worried," she said, "not badly, but they're uncertain." "I know," Edric said. "You could talk to them, explain." He looked at her steadily. "What would I explain?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," she said, which was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had said in the conversation. "I suppose that depends on what's actually happening." She left. He closed the door. He stood in his cottage for a moment, listening to her footsteps move down the path and out through the gate, and then he turned back to the room where Ash was watching him from the hearthstone with its amber eyes and its expression that was not readable but was absolutely present. "I don't entirely know what's happening either," he told it. Ash blinked once slowly. "That makes 2 of us," he said, and went back to work. The wings were the first thing he saw change in a way that was undeniable. For the first week and a half, they had been changing in increments too small to argue with individually. A little less translucent, a little more structured at the leading edge, the veining slightly thicker, the membrane slightly more opaque. Each day's change was small enough that he could have attributed it to the light or to his own variable attention. But on the 13th morning, he came downstairs to find Ash already awake and standing in the middle of the cottage floor, wings extended, and the wings were different in a way that could not be explained by light or attention. They were perhaps half again their original span. Still folded, they had been unnoticeable in size, compact, tidy, the wings of something that had not yet needed them. Extended, they filled the middle of the small cottage with a presence that was not threatening but was significant in the way that all large things are significant, by the simple fact of the space they occupied. The light caught them differently now. The translucence was nearly gone at the base, replaced by the deep copper black of the main scales. Only at the very edges, the trailing membrane, did the early thinness remain, and even there it was thickening, becoming. Ash held the extension for perhaps 30 seconds, perfectly still, as if measuring something internal, the new reach, the new weight, the new calculation of what it now was. Then the wings folded back with a precision that was clearly more considered than it had been 2 weeks ago, the joints finding their positions with the confidence of something that had practiced this in some internal rehearsal Edric had not been present for. Ash looked at him. Edric looked at the wings. He looked at the space they had occupied. He looked at the ceiling of his cottage, which was not a high ceiling. "You're going to get larger," he said. Ash looked at him with an expression that strongly suggested it, found this observation unnecessary. "This cottage," he said carefully, "was built for one person who is not going to grow." Ash sat down and curled its tail around its feet. "I'm not saying it's a problem," Edric said. "I'm saying it's going to require some thinking." He made his tea. He sat at the bench. He looked at the cottage with different eyes than he had looked at it for the 11 years he had lived in it, measuring not what it was but what it might become, which angles might be opened, which spaces might be reconfigured, what a man with reasonable carpentry skills and access to good timber might do with a structure that needed to grow. He was, he noted, approaching this as a problem to be solved rather than a reason to revise the larger situation. He noted this without comment, even to himself. He found the old boundary marker on the 15th day. He had been walking the eastern edge of his land, not a large piece of land, a modest holding that included the cottage, the yard, a strip of meadow running to the treeline, and a portion of the treeline itself, mostly old pine, for the first time in years, motivated by a vague and not yet articulated thought about space. Ash walked beside him. It walked beside him consistently now, not behind, that had shifted somewhere in the second week, and had not shifted back. And the besideness of it had become simply the fact of how they moved through the world when they moved through it together. The boundary marker was a stone post, waist-high, carved with the old property symbols of the region. Edric had known it was there in the abstract way a man knows where his boundaries are without having recently stood at them. Standing at it now, he looked from the post into the treeline, and then along the meadow, and he was doing the calculations he was doing not quite consciously yet, or perhaps consciously but not yet admitted. There was space here, more than he had been using. The meadow strip alone was substantial. He had never done much with it, had let it run to grass and the occasional wildflower, had moved through it and past it without particular engagement. To the east, where the pines began, the ground was level before it rose toward the deeper forest. Dry ground, good drainage. A structure built here not inside the cottage but adjacent to it, connected perhaps by a covered passage, built of the same stone as the existing walls for warmth. A structure with a higher roof with the ceiling beams placed for a creature that was going to grow at the rate Ash appeared to be growing would require 3 weeks of serious work, probably. 6 if he was careful about the stone. He knew a man in the village who laid stone well. He could manage the timber himself. He stood at the boundary marker for a while doing this arithmetic. Ash stood beside him and looked at the tree line with what Edric had come to recognize as its considering expression, interested, alert, processing. "What do you see?" he asked. He had begun doing this, asking Ash questions it could not answer in any language he spoke, simply for the practice of articulating the question. He had decided this was not absurd. It was, at worst, talking to oneself, which was something he had done occasionally for 38 years and found useful. Ash looked at the trees for another moment, then looked at the meadow, then looked at Edric. Then it looked at the meadow again, and Edric had the distinct and not quite rational impression that it was showing him something. That the look was not incidental. That it was pointing, in the only way available to something that did not have words, at the space between them and the tree line. He looked at the meadow. He looked at his cottage, visible over his shoulder, sitting solid and plain in its yard. He looked at the space between them. "Yes," he said, "I was thinking the same thing." The conversations with the village did not happen all at once because Edric was not a man who managed things all at once. They happened in pieces in the ordinary friction of days. Merritt had been the first, and after Merritt came others, and he met them all with the same quality of attention, straightforward, not defensive, not expansive. He answered what was asked. He did not volunteer what was not. He was not keeping a dragon. He was not a dragon keeper. He was a man who had been chosen by a dragon in the way that, as the old books and Merritt's grandmother's stories and even Paris's half-remembered text all agreed, with varying degrees of accuracy and various amounts of embellishment, the choosing happened. Not by drama, not by quest or combat or the fulfillment of some prophesied condition. By proximity, by being present in the right place without the wrong intentions. by crouching down to look at an empty shell because the hands moved before the mind finished thinking. He told the truth when he told this, which helped. People trusted him not because he was charming, he was not particularly charming, but because he had never been caught lying, and a reputation built on that particular negative was surprisingly solid. They listened. They asked their questions. Some of them arrived at concern, some at wonder, some at the practical curiosity of people who live close to the land and have always maintained a complicated relationship with the older things that share it. Old Paris said he was in the records, not Edric specifically, but the pattern. The man working alone at the forest's edge, the morning choosing, the hatchling, and the boot. There were 4 instances that Paris could recall from whatever texts he had consumed in his long and bookish life, spread across 4 different centuries in 4 different parts of the known world. Always someone quiet, Paris said, with the satisfaction of a man finding a pattern. Always someone who wasn't trying to be found. Edric thought about this. He thought about the men in those other centuries, in those other countries, the shape of their mornings, the weight of their axes, the particular quality of stillness that had made them visible to something that had just opened its eyes on the world and needed to know where home was. He thought about what Paris had called them in the old texts. Hearthbound, the texts apparently called it, not the dragon, the person, the one chosen. Hearthbound because the hatchling had decided they were its hearth, its fixed point, the warm and constant thing around which it would orient itself while it grew into what it was going to become. He was someone's hearth. He turned this over carefully. He was not certain he had ever been anyone's anything in any serious, lasting way, and the idea had a weight to it that was neither bad nor comfortable but was simply real, the way genuinely true things always have a certain gravity that distinguishes them from ideas that only feel true. He did not mention this to anyone. It did not seem like a thing to mention. It seemed like a thing to carry. On the 21st day, 3 weeks from the morning of the empty shell, Edric sat by the fire in the evening with the kind of tiredness that is not distress but completion, the tiredness of a day worked fully, a body used well, a mind that has processed what it needed to process and arrived somewhere. He had spent the afternoon marking out the foundation of the new structure along the eastern edge of the yard. He had good timber selected, stacked near the gate. The stone mason could come next week. Ash was on the hearthstone. It had grown again, increments he catalogued unconsciously now, checking each morning the way one checks weather, accepting the information and adjusting accordingly. Its tail, when it curled around itself in the evening, now reached further. Its head, when it raised to look at him, was slightly higher from the floor. The wings, folded, showed at the shoulder a new definition, muscle developing beneath scale. The body engineering itself toward what it was always going to be, patient and certain. It looked at him now across the hearths. The fire was low, the good steady low of a fire well-banked, not dying but resting. The cottage was warm. Outside, Edric could hear the wind beginning to move in the upper branches of the pines at the forest's edge, a sound he had listened to from this hearth for 11 years, a sound so familiar it had become part of his silence rather than a disruption of it. He had been thinking in the unfocused way of evening thinking about what Merritt had said, about the 2 schools of thought, whether you named the creature or received the name it already had. He had thought about the afternoon light and the word arriving fully formed from somewhere below his conscious intention. He had thought about Ash looking up when he said it, the slow curl of the tail that followed. He thought it was probably both things at once, that the name had been there, waiting in some in-between place, and his mind had been the medium through which it passed into the world, and the moment of it had been a kind of recognition rather than invention, a meeting of 2 ends of the same thread. He thought about home in the same way, that it was probably not a place you built or claimed, but a thing that assembled itself around you while you were busy with ordinary work, wood and stone and the daily crossing of familiar ground, and you looked up one morning and it was there, had been there, would have been impossible to prevent. He thought about the men in Paris's texts, their quiet mornings, the hatchlings that had followed them home from forests or markets or riverbanks, that had installed themselves in their cottages with the absolute confidence of something that already knew where it lived before it arrived. He thought about what those men had become over the years, not dragon riders, not dragon keepers, not the grand titles of the old stories, but simply people who had been chosen, who had accepted the choosing, who had built their lives with that new weight in them and found that the weight was not a burden but a kind of ballast, something that steadied a man. He was not afraid of what came next. This surprised him when he examined it. He had expected to find some residue of his original resistance still lodged somewhere in his chest, some remaining objection to the situation that had not yet been metabolized. But he searched and found nothing of the kind. What he found in its place was something quieter and more useful than fear or its absence, something that was simply readiness. The orientation of a man who has understood the shape of what is coming, and has made his peace with it not by surrender but by recognition. He looked at Ash. Ash looked at him. The amber eyes in the firelight were extraordinary, not frightening, not alien, but genuinely extraordinary, the way very old things are extraordinary when you allow yourself to see them clearly without the lens of expectation. There was a depth in them that Edric had stopped trying to measure because measurement was the wrong tool. Some things you did not measure. You acknowledged them, you sat with them. You let them be what they were without demanding they reduce themselves to something you could fit inside a sentence. "You're going to be very large," he said. Ash held his gaze steadily. "Probably inconvenient," Edric said, "for both of us in various ways." The amber eyes did not waver. "I'm not complaining," he said, and he realized as he said it, telling the complete truth. "I'm just nodding it." He leaned back in his chair, the fire settled. The wind moved through the pines outside, and above the pines the winter sky would be doing its work, the stars arranging themselves in their old configurations, the cold pressing down on the fields, the world beyond the cottage continuing with the indifference it always showed to the arrangements made inside small, warm rooms. The world did not care what happened inside the rooms. It had its own business. Inside the room, a man and a dragon that was going to grow into something extraordinary sat on either side of a fire that was not going out. And the silence between them was the silence of a thing that had been decided without being announced, confirmed without being spoken, written without ink into the simple daily fact of their presence in the same space. This was what home was, Edric thought. Not a place, not a building, not the particular arrangement of walls and timber and hearthstone that he had lived inside for 11 years. Home was this, the certainty of a fixed point, the warmth of something that chose to stay, the morning knowledge that the boot by the door would have something sleeping against it, that the fire would be watched from the hearthstone by eyes that were learning the world slowly and had decided to learn it from here. He had been someone's hearth without knowing it. He had been the fixed point someone was orienting by. And perhaps he turned this thought over one final time before letting it settle. Perhaps that was what he had been missing for longer than he had known he was missing it. Not company exactly, not the general presence of other people which the village provided in adequate supply. But this specific thing being the constant, being the thing something turned toward when it needed to know where home was. He was 38 years old. He had carried heavy things for most of his life and had stopped noticing the weight. He was adding one more weight, the most unlikely weight he could have predicted for himself, and he could already tell that this one he would notice not because it was heavy, but because it was warm and particular and alive and growing, and entirely its own. He did not reach out to touch Ash. He did not need to. Ash was on its hearthstone and he was in his chair, and the distance between them was the right distance, the distance of two things that understood each other across a room. The fire breathed. The cottage held them both. Outside, the pine forest kept its long patience, the trees standing in their earned stillness, and somewhere in the dark between the roots of one of them was a shallow depression and two pieces of rust-red shell that had held, for a brief and necessary time, everything that was now here. Edric closed his eyes. He was not asleep, not yet, not for some time yet, but he let the evening settle over him with the specific quality of an evening that has earned its own quiet. The fire's warmth. The sound of Ash's breathing, which had become as familiar as the sound of the wind in the pines, which is to say, indistinguishable now from the sound of the place itself, from the sound of home. He did not say good night. He had not said it any of the previous 20 evenings. It did not seem to need saying. The day ended and they were both in it, and tomorrow the day would begin and they would both be in that too, and the boot would be at the door and Ash would be against it, and the fire would be built up before dawn, and the world would continue in its ordinary, extraordinary way, and they would continue in theirs. The hearthstone was warm, the boot was by the door. The name had been given or received, both, probably, which was as it should be. Edric breathed, Ash breathed. The room held them and they held the room, and outside the universe conducted its enormous indifferent business. And inside, something small and ancient and permanent had quietly, without ceremony, without drama, with nothing but the absolute certainty of a thing that has found what it was looking for, come home.